Thank you very much, Sam, and welcome everyone to our webinar today on the constructive narratives for home heat decarbonisation. As Sam so kindly introduced me already, I'm Dr. Hanne Knight. I'm at the University of Plymouth in the beautiful southwest of England, and we have beautiful sunny weather today as well. I hope it's nice wherever you are. So this project ran from September last year through to March, so a relatively concise timeframe. But we've got some sort of brilliant findings that I'm very excited to share with you. This was a collaborative project from me, so I was the lead here in collaboration with Dr. Sue Langford, who's also here at the University of Plymouth and was my research assistant helping with quite a lot of the work. As Sam said as well, very happy to take questions at the end, very happy for this to be a discussion. And also if anybody has questions, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to sort of continue the conversation. What I want to start with, and again, Sam did a really nice introduction there already. As we all know, achieving net zero is crucial. It's something a lot of governments across the world have set out to do, to achieve. And heat pumps is a really important part for the building industry in particular. However, adoption does remain slow in very many markets. And one part or one aspect of this project was really to try to understand how communication can help to sort of making citizens see heat pumps as an opportunity, as being feasible, beneficial, and supported as well. My background is in communication, especially sustainability communication. And that's why it was a really interesting sort of project for me to be involved with, to really particularly look at heat pump adoption and how narratives across the globe in sort of different contexts can help us to almost take the best bits and see what can be scalable, what can be transferable, and what can we learn from campaigns that are currently happening. So I want to start with a bit of a figure done by Notebook LM, so just for clear transparency here. But what it shows really nicely, and it's based on sort of the work that we've been doing, is we've got quite a function area on the left here. So call it the decarbonisation bottleneck, which is, there are net zero targets. As I said, lots of governments have them. There's a lot of subsidies available. I know in the UK, for example, we've got a £7.5 scheme for people wanting to install a heat pump, and the technology is there. However, this lag between having these sort of positive aspects on the left to actual installation, as we said, there's a bit of a, low uptake when it comes to actual installation. And this is where we look at the household decision as the bottleneck here. Okay, something seems to be going not necessarily wrong, but maybe not completely correctly yet to be able to transition what we've got on the left actually with net zero target subsidies and technology into the actual installation in households. So what we set out with this research project was to really look at what are constructive climate narratives for heat pumps. Okay, what's been happening? What has been happening in different countries? What evidence can we find where that has been done successfully? We're very keen to establish an international database of cases that really possibly or hopefully highlighted best practice, but also those who didn't. It was definitely important to learn from. And then we were keen, and this is sort of the third bit of this research project, is to look at coming up with a framework that can help communication professionals to evaluate policy-led communication campaigns and see what can we take from that, what can we use from it, what can we copy, what shouldn't we copy, a bit of a hands-on practical framework to help evaluate the campaigns that are currently out there to transfer the learning within these. So in order to achieve those aims, we've structured the research around 3 different subtasks, okay? And today's presentation will be structured around these subtasks. So we've got 3 in total aiming to fulfill the aims that we set out for this research project. And the first one is a rapid evidence assessment, okay? So we've looked at the current literature, what has been done in the field of heat pump communication, or home decarbonisation in some cases, because we had to make it a tiny bit more generic to be able to have a substantial amount of sort of literature to work with. Not just academic literature, we focused on policy reports, NGO reporting as well. So anything we could get our hands on that looks at sort of heat pump from a communicative point of view. The second subtask was all about the case study database, okay? So we want to look for good cases where the narrative seems to have worked, adoption seems to have been sort of improving. And we looked at secondary data here, so anything that's available online, as well as conducting semi-structured interviews, so primary data collection with campaign leaders from different sort of governments as well as NGOs. We did 18 in total to really try to understand some of these communication campaigns better. Again, learn from some of the drawbacks as well as from some of the things that have gone really well. And then finally, we came up with this policy evidence quality criteria, which is meant to be this practical guidance for policymakers or communication specialists to take away and really see how they can evaluate campaigns and see what they can learn from those. So I'm going to start with the rapid evidence assessment, and you see on the top right-hand corner, one for REA. So that just gives you a bit of a guidance of the findings for the REA. Okay, so we're sticking to one subtask here and then moving on to the second and the third. So the rapid evidence assessment was meaning to give us a bit of what's currently known in the literature, what kind of studies have been conducted, what has been done in both policy professional as well as academic literature to understand sort of the messaging, but also what channel seems to be working, how important are intermediaries, and how does that impact sort of consumer confidence in adoption? Because ultimately, obviously, that's what we want to learn. How can we make people increase the uptake of heat pumps in different markets? What was most important for us is here to, again, try to learn how to design those communication strategies, what's been tested. The positive aspect about using existing studies is to really see how they tested the different framings, for example, narratives as well. And this is something we did in the first rapid evidence assessment. Some of the core questions we addressed here is how is it framed, right? Is it about comfort, about costs? Is it about good versus bad? Yeah, how in the academic and professional as well as policy literature, how have they tested these different frames? Which seem to be most effective? And the last one, which is really important, is really looking at these intermediaries and what does the current literature tell us about how far they are trusted, and how do they sort of play a role in the adoption journey. So we've identified 4 different themes down here. So where we focused on the framing itself, then the role of trusted messengers. We then looked at contextual influences as well. So that's something that came out of the literature review, as well as then the emerging practices for evaluating communication intervention. So what is currently being done within these campaigns to determine whether people or whether campaigns have worked or haven't worked. So I'm going to walk you through these different sort of findings initially. And please bear in mind, this is based on what the literature tells us already, okay? So across all of the reviewed studies, we found a set of communication factors that seems to really have an impact on adoption, okay? And I need to clarify here, adoption is not just measured as actually people buying a heat pump, okay? Adoption is a curved measure in lots of the different studies. So even things like inquiring for a heat pump or asking for more information or asking to see a heat pump, there's lots of different forms of how adoption has been measured, okay? But for the purpose of this webinar, I sort of put them into adoption to give you a good overview of what seems to be working consistently. So the perceived financial attractiveness and risk is a really important one, okay? So really looking at how how much money can I save? So campaigns that really stress that framing as cost saving have worked particularly well, not surprisingly, I guess. The clarity and transparency of information. So transparency in particular, as we all know, heat pump and a lot of net zero technologies is hard to explain how they work. It's hard to make the common audience understand what they do. So really that transparency is really crucial here. Perceived hassle and process complexity is another one. Especially those campaigns or those studies that looked at reduced hassle, or that told the audience how there isn't going to be any hassle because you're going to be supported by an installer, for example, or other ways of how that hassle can be reduced for the audience, seem to be working really well. Suitability to the home and region, which is clear. Social norms and peer examples work really well. So in those studies that showed how others have used the heat pump, seem to be doing better than those with abstract terminology, for example. And then finally, also the quality of interactions with intermediaries. So depending on who brought that message made a big impact as well. We put this or designed this sort of framework just based on the literature, which seems to be this clear financial offer. So what's in it for me, whether that's a grant or whether that's cost savings, reinforced by peer visibility. So giving that option of what somebody else has said, then reassuring on performance of the heat pump. So it is going to be reliable, it's going to be working, reinforced by credible guidance on what can you do, where can you find help if you need to. And then finally, why now framing through security and societal benefit? Okay, why should somebody act on it now, get the grant now, and do a heat pump? So this is sort of what we've taken from the first bit of the literature. There's a lot of there on there already, not always just in relation to heat pumps, as I said, sometimes other options as well, but it's just a nice overview to get us started. So the role of a trusted messenger was really important in all of those academic studies in particular that they've looked at already, is that we need to make sure that whoever is sending that message in terms of best messenger is trusted, because that will influence uptake. Okay, so when you think of a heat pump as a high involvement, high cost decision, and what the vast majority of audience, when asked in these academic studies in particular, they said, things like, what will this mean for my house, my bills, and my comfort are really important. So when we looked at intermediaries generally, it was definitely important to try to see how we can ensure that they do instill that trust in people. And I will show you in a minute, but that had differences depending on which location we were looking at. So that's something we need to take into consideration as well. So I've highlighted a few studies here in particular that have that national context. And for example, a study here by Barnes and Snape as well, even though Snape is a little bit older already, find that in the UK and Scotland, for example, there was a need for clearly long-term national narrative, okay? So when we look at those in Scotland here, for example, I think that's where the study by Lying is in, for example, they want to feel informed and prepared. So there's a lot about ongoing support and peer recommendation that can be useful. If you look at the Irish context, another study, there were actually a couple as well, Amilis et al. 2022. They found, for example, that segmentation is absolutely crucial, okay? So that when it comes to narratives and communication, we need to clearly work with different segments. So a story or how to make somebody who is very much into sustainability and doing well needs a different conversation as opposed to that person that is sort of more cautious around it, maybe not that involved yet, doesn't want to put as much effort into it. So this study showed a lot on how segmentation is absolutely crucial. So studies set more in the Nordic countries, so think Finland, Norway, and Sweden. By Jaeger, for example, or AIA, they looked at what works best, and there was that sort of comfort, okay, and performance in harsh climate. So again, localizing what's important there might not be as relevant in the southwest of the UK, for example, where I'm located. Canada and the US, they really found, Corbett et al., for example, that willingness per region is completely different. Okay, as you know, US and Canada are huge countries, and something that might be working in the east of Canada might not be working in the west of Canada. Okay, again, different climates, different housing stock as well. Houses might look different, might be built differently. So it's really important to take that into consideration. And Greece, this one study is a little bit older already, but it's interesting here because it was based in, in the recession, and there the context was obviously should be all about affordability and access to finance. So how can I do this with the current financial situation? So just here as a point is narrative strategies must be context specific. And I think this is a really nice overview that demonstrates that quite well. So the core themes seem to be working across these different studies. So cost, comfort, climate, convenience, call it the 4 Cs, but different emphasis depending on, economy, the state of the housing stock, policy regime, as well as climate. So that brings us to the last bit of subtask 1 as well. So we've reviewed those studies according to how campaigns have been evaluated, okay? Because it's really interesting to see anybody who's got, communication background, marketing background, comms background, is, we need to show whether something has worked, right? And that was one of the parts we want to look at in the literature as well. And based on the recommendation, the most credible evaluation seemed to be a combination. There was quite a lot about experimental message testing, mixed methods audience research as well, and segmentation. So what works for one might not be working for the other. A lot about operational metrics. So, likes, comments on social media campaigns, for example. Program uptake. So if you think of grants within a different country was a common method. And then system level tracking against targets that have been set was done in a couple of studies as well. So that concludes sort of the first subtask. So really that's what the literature tells us, okay, what we have done or what has been done to date. And we conducted the literature review in sort of September, October time to really have a good basis of what seems to be currently happening. And then we took that approach to really identify case studies, okay? So where are cases where this has happened successfully, where campaigns have been executed, and how can we use sort of the work and the knowledge that we've gained through the rapid evidence assessment. And I've noticed I'm using literature review and rapid evidence assessment sort of interchangeably. It is more or less the same thing, except that rapid evidence assessment is slightly less in depth than a proper structured literature review. Okay, so it might well be that a paper might have been missed, for example, but we really focus on getting those information in academic policy and practitioner industries together and really try to draw this picture. So what we want to do here is really try to see how those cases that we've identified can be cross-compared. What can we learn from this? What really is done in terms of who the different senders of these communication campaigns are, and what different pathways or channels are being used. As such, we have conducted 18 international interviews, semi-structured interviews with international partners in different countries. I've highlighted that on the right, which were sort of government-based as well as organizations. Okay, so we've got the European Heat Pump Association as one interviewee, RAP as well, Global Strategic Communication Council, Nesta, MSC Foundation, the Consortium for Energy Efficiency, all groups that have worked or have been part of a campaign around heat pump adoption. And then countries like the US, UK, Canada, Poland, Spain, and Sweden, Germany. For some countries, we had a couple of interviews as well, which was really interesting. But our aim was to really try to understand what makes those messages credible, adoptable, and transferable across contexts, because obviously that was the main goal, to see how we can provide information that is sort of applicable and usable to a lot of practitioners working in that field. So this is a bit overwhelming. I do apologize my use of Notebook LM, but I've had this amazing, really simplified thematic map on my, I think I used Word actually for it, and then asked Notebook LM to do it. And it does look much better, but do excuse some spelling mistakes, which I know is a problem with AI. And I won't go through all of this in detail now, but I thought it would be great for those of you who want to go back, because we have identified sort of 8 themes based on the semi-structured interviews. So reoccurring topics that came sort of into or being formed into themes that seems to be reoccurring across all those, or at least most of those semi-structured interviews. So the main theme here was about the pragmatic and multi-benefit choice. That was all about pragmatism in particular. In the next few slides, I've picked up a couple of, well, a few themes actually, and we'll go into more detail. But I thought it would be really helpful for you to just see a bit of an overview as well. Second theme was all about building trust in a contested information. And Sam earlier talked about misinformation already. And that was a huge thing that we sort of came across throughout this whole research project. And I've got a couple of slides about that at the end as well. Theme 3 was all about localized targeting and reach. Theme 4 was about digital first ecosystems and the use of AI, because that's something that when it comes to building trust or the use of intermediaries, really talking about the sender of those communication, it was really interesting to see a lot of the digital first sort of ecosystems that are being used across different campaigns. Theme 5 was all about evaluating systems success in a complex ecologies. We've got theme 6 with policy accessibility as communication. So again, as you can imagine, that really changes across different contexts. Got theme 7 with different tools as infrastructure. For example, the cost calculator in Canada, which is one of our case studies, is one of such tools that can really help when it comes to these campaigns. And theme 8 was the installer gatekeeper strategy. Okay, again, installer as an intermediary used much more in some contexts than others, and that was a really relevant and interesting finding for us as well. But as I said, I've got a few slides, and you see in the top right corner again, now we are 2 case studies, so that's the second subtask of our research project. So when it comes to one of the major themes, really, what we found when talking to those professionals is that heat pumps are not sold as climate choices, but as better everyday heating. Okay, and I thought that was a really interesting finding already, but it's much more around cost and certainty, bill savings, comfort, convenience, cleanliness, energy security, independence. Okay. And I assume now, in particular, with what's going on in the world, that energy security and independence is even a more important factor to consider. But what we found when talking to our interviewees is climate is secondary, but never absent. Okay, so especially when it comes to talking about these dominant drivers, comparing and combining that with sort of local air quality and fairness, localized context seem to be those campaigns that have worked particularly well. One quote here, we discovered that the climate is not a real factor that mobilizes people, so we decided to put the focus on comfort, health, and quality of life. Okay. So implication, when we really think about communication management, for example, we would always say lead with financial and comfort benefits, then as a secondary sort of bonus offer environmental values, okay, but not as the main premise, because it does not seem to resonate with people as much. And this is linked to the academic literature as well, is even more contested with misinformation. But as I said, I will talk about misinformation later in more detail. So another theme is this trust being built through messengers, not messengers. So it matters much more who says it than what is being said. And one of the really common findings that we were delighted to hear actually, but it seems to be really working well as those authentic household case studies. And I think it was Nesta in the UK as well who did this visit a heat pump, for example, where people could inquire about visiting a household that has already got a heat pump, and those with a heat pump would volunteer their time to let people into their home to look how it works. And this really authentic communicating what it's like to have a heat pump seems to be working really well. High Trust is also independent expert at NGOs. And as you've seen, we've got quite a few NGOs that we have interviewed. Sorry. Government is still perceived as trusted, depending on the country, but mainly only when it's backed with tangible support. Okay, so when there is a grant, for example, to be applied for, or something where the audience would see, okay, something is given back to me if I aim to do something good for the environment. Strategic trust practice, things like peer stories, for example, or provide tools, not slogan, was another one that came across quite strongly. A calculator, for example, that I've mentioned earlier is one of such example. Another quote here, every time people could put themselves in the shoes of a user or got professional advice, but not necessarily from scientists, but real practitioners, those were the pieces that we noticed really had the best viewing rates and share rates, okay? So all about that sort of authenticity. When we think about the implication for communication specialists, it does depend. So campaign success does depend on trusted senders and those lived experience, more so than just relatively mass-produced government slogans. One of the last or second to last themes that I wanted to unpick with regards to the semi-structured interviews is around the context as well as digital ecosystems. And I put them somewhat together, even though they should be seen sort of in a separate way as well. But it's all about that local tailoring, okay? We've talked about housing stock in our REA findings as well. So, what does it mean in my context? Cultural pricing is sensitive as well to different places, different nationalities, different areas within countries as well. So that's really important. And also the historic energy narratives matter. Okay, so how do we used to get our energy? How has that shifted? What's the general uptake around green energy, for example? It's really important when it comes to locally tailoring your message and your communication campaign. Digitally first, so that translate to that to a certain extent, but we were surprised as a research team by how far or how often campaigns are purely digital. There were a handful that would offer in combination with digital delivery sort of offline use as well. But it's something that looking at what seems to be working or doesn't needs to definitely be reviewed by those senders of heat pump communication campaigns. Because personalization, especially online as well, can be done really well. And I'm not just talking about using, somebody's name in an email, but knowing the local vicinity, knowing what the housing stock looks like, knowing what people might have inquired about before, the more personalized those messages can be, the better. AI is just as a side note, because I do find it quite interesting, is being used already for editing, targeting, and audience insights, but very carefully adopted at this stage when it comes to communication campaigns. Yeah, this was an example of a respondent 9 who said, put in information about the existing heating system and then it calculates what it will cost to switch over. So it wasn't necessarily about energy savings or carbon reduction, but it was really about, how much will it cost me to change to a heat pump? So very hands-on, very looking at those helping tools that can help make it authentic and fitting for that particular person. So there's another sort of implication based on this theme that we found is don't export campaigns, export principles, localized narratives, and channels. So evaluation was the last theme from the case studies that we really wanted to focus on, is to really see how are currently campaign managers looking at whether their campaign has been successful. And I said earlier, sort of adoption in the academic and practitioner and policy literature is defined differently and not just as, okay, they bought a heat pump. And that's something we find across the case studies that we've looked at as well. There is a lot of sort of behavioral proxies, think about any sort of metrics you can get online. And I guess that is linked to the vast majority of campaigns not vast majority, but a majority of the campaigns being done online. But also things like scheme data, so how many grant applications have there been since the campaign has been run, for example. We also have sort of social proof indicators across different campaigns where it was about, how much is actually being talked about this campaign in the press, have they picked up on it, whether it's industry related press, things like building industry, for example, how much has been talked about this campaign and the options and possibilities and opportunities that come with some of the grants that are being offered, for example. So concluding or evaluating, we can say that measure can change along the adoption journey. So that's probably one of the most important thing here. It's not just about did they buy a heat pump, but how far did we move them along the customer journey? Okay, so even more inquiries is already a success. And then looking at these different evaluation tools, but not just the installation itself. Perfect. So it's a bit of a persuasion shift here. Obviously, I know not all messages are in that traditional way, but it was just meant to show you that, stark contrast of how we have to move from sort of the traditional climate messaging to a constructive narrative ecosystem. So if we think of a primary hook, how we can get people interested in the message, it should be less about abstract sort of net zero goals or other technology that people don't understand. It needs to be about economic feasibility, bill stability, and physical comfort. When we look at the messenger, again, we think about trust, and based on sort of those who we have spoken with, local installers, peers are much more trustworthy for lots of people than high-level government messaging, for example. Channel broadcast mass awareness campaigns versus human-to-human interaction supported by digital tools. Okay, that is one of the major findings here as well. Yes, digital social media campaigns are fantastic, but actually that support with the human-to-human installers, intermediaries who provide that trust are really essential. And then the format, shifting it from complex technical data and broad promises to really being clear about the process that's important when it comes to installing a heat pump, actionable steps, and lived experience stories. And that brings us on to the final subtask. I think it's been half an hour, Sam, so I'm well aware of the time here. But that is really trying to get a framework that can help assess the quality of narrative and campaigns. Okay, so it's really important to us to design something that can be used in practice to be able to say, how can we learn from those campaigns that are already out there? And this is the framework. We've got 5 sections on the left. You see the first 3 in this slide and the next 2 on the next slide. But it's all about having that criteria, and those criteria range between sort of the strategic relevance of the message to looking at the narrative content to reviewing the sender and scoring it in like a rec color system. Okay, so are these criteria there? Can I find it? Is it evidenced in this particular campaign that I'm reviewing? And the other 2 sections where Section D and E are about evidence and evaluation and learning. So how have these campaigns evaluated their success? How can we learn from that? And the final section is all about sort of context, ethics, and transferability. Okay, so are there measures in place, for example, that can counter misinformation, which is quite an important one. And then we've got here in the bottom, you see the summary page that can help. This is an Excel sheet, so it's quite easy to extend or reduce. You don't have to complete it either, but we've done this with 5 particular case studies, even though we have reviewed, I think, about 20, 25 in overall, which not all specifically around heat pumps because there weren't as many. But we've really looked at 5 different campaigns and used this quality criteria to see where we can learn from. So these are the 5 dimensions I've just talked about. And these are sort of the case studies we've looked at in more detail. Okay, so the Heat Pump Day by the European Heat Pump Association, the Visit a Heat Pump campaign by Nesta, Canada, the Heat Pumps Payoff Calculator campaign, Germany was Woche der Wärmepumpe, which is Week of the Heat Pump. And we had some information from China as well that we've looked at to see what is being done there. I will share a couple of the findings there with you, especially those that are transferable, because that's most important. But again, in the report, we have done the quality framework and really seen quite clearly what we can learn from the different campaigns. So not surprisingly, but the case study quality framework did show that these communication strategies operate within a broader socio-technical system. So it's really important to understand the policy frameworks around us, the market readiness as well. Coming from a communication background, when we think of segmentation and how ready the market is a huge, huge impact. Also, some that a case study showed, especially the ones that are really effective in increasing adoption, was all when it was closely aligned with clear policy instruments. Okay, think about grants or support; those really seem to be working better than those where that isn't the case. Okay. Also, in the context where there isn't grants or anything strictly available, communication was less about persuading people to adopt heat pumps and more about reducing that uncertainty. Okay, so it could be about educating your consumer, it could be moving your market somewhat further in the market readiness stage. And when we think about sort of where policy frameworks were available, but if they were unstable or ambiguous, so people don't understand them, for example, it was way harder to build that trusted relationship. And we really had to think clearly about what could be done in terms of enhancing that sort of credibility perception of the sender in this particular context. Most of the limitations we found within this sort of when applying the quality framework was around the evaluation of campaigns. So that was the criteria number I think actually number 4, that actually is really difficult to evaluate campaigns. Okay. Yes, we can rely on primarily metrics, that are about media reach, for example, or digital engagement, because it's easy to measure a click or a share or a comment. But what does that translate to? And that was quite difficult. Okay. So actually across all the case studies, we found that was probably the biggest limitations, is trying to understand how long decision cycles are being impacted, and how can we move these people across different willingness to adopt. So when we combined all 3 packages to give a bit of a communication framework around heat pump adoption journey. Again, another nice notebook LM figure that makes it look more pretty, I guess. But I want to make sure on the left that it's just very clear that there are 3 narrative foundations that look at the economic feasibility, that should be more stressed environmental messaging. It should be all about performance reassurance and comfort. We need process clarity and reduce hassle. Okay, so this has come out in the literature as well as supported by our own primary data, and further sort of established. The communication ecosystem here, it should be a hybrid digital human journey. We can't underestimate the power of human intermediaries, and policy should be a narrative signal, especially there where we have grants and other support available. And then the social techno system is important as well. Context-dependent narratives are really important. Social proof and local normalization, and then integrated social technical approaches that again combine the 2. Perfect. So before I finish, I want to tell you a little bit about a recurring theme, because the misinformation came about in literally all the subtasks, and is something that has been identified by the academic literature to a certain extent already, but not as stark as we have found in both our interviews, as well as some of the literature that we have found that was more generically around sort of sustainable or net zero based technology. And it is a non-neutral information environment. Okay, people have ideas around climate change. They have misconception or real conception or worries about what that means for us. And I just literally Googled heat pumps, and this is what came up on Facebook. And I want to highlight this. I'm not going to read it all out, but the first comment is, they're putting them, the heat pumps, in social housing and encouraging everyone to go for them with a disaster waiting to happen. It's all part of their big plan, get us all completely reliant on electricity for everything. Then all they have to do is switch off the supply, control sorted. Okay. And that was a narrative that kind of keeps on coming when you look at it. So misinformation, this is a great example of how it can shape public opinion. Okay. But we have to be careful whether it's misinformation or rational fiction. So I want to just highlight that here. Strategic misinformation is sold as well by other organizations that aren't as keen on the green energy transition as maybe some others. It's often deployed as a mixture of fake and facts and fake news, legal or using threats, but also some comments on social media. We need a different intervention to these kind of misinformation. So it should be all about really making sure that we've got pre-approved rebuttals ready, staff capacity to deal with the strategic misinformation. But as you can imagine, that's expensive, right? And feedback from a lot of our respondents was that's just not possible. And this is actually one of those responded 11. If you're going to do disinformation stuff, realistically, it's quite time intensive in order to prevent the comment section from completely dissolving into just chaos. Okay. So we need to identify strategic misinformation versus rational fiction. Okay. So if it's just because people really don't have an idea, they don't understand, they're experiencing feasibility anxiety, they just can't afford it. This is a comment from respondent 2. I can't afford it. So this is not just a matter of misinformation. It's a matter of how to manage the reaction of people who say, okay, I understand the messages you're sharing with me, but I cannot do what you asked me to do. So that's what we call rational fiction. And the intervention is differently, okay? So where these barriers are procedural, we need to look at clear guidance, cost savings, and accessibility to a broader market. So this is just a bit of a pyramid to show when it comes to misinformation operations is that social listening and listening what's happening, what are our customers saying or potential customers as well, and have that tiered sort of response way of either thinking about tier 1 proactive pre-bunking. So have things like, frequently asked questions, for example. We always say don't use the word myth busting because it does acknowledge then falsehood, which it shouldn't really. We've got tier 2, which should be monitored restraint. So be more broad in terms of monitoring your sentiment, but again, without validating and getting into arguments with some of these narratives. You say adopt the don't feed the trolls approach. So, just answer wherever necessary where you can. And then selective correction is tier 3. So really try to prioritize those that seem to have a high reach when it comes to spreading misinformation. Brilliant. So overall takeaway and learning. I hope this has become quite clear now, but I just wanted to summarize here as well. Communication cannot alone drive adoption. It's about this integrated role. Also, a key role is to reduce uncertainty. So don't just think about adoption as your end goal. And we need informed decisions about cost, suitability, and installation. The financial considerations are really important for people. Trust in real world and assurance, often delivered by installers, is really crucial. And have that alignment between communication with policy, emphasizing practical benefit and adapting to misinformation and changing conditions. And as a very last slide here, I've just put a bit of a checklist together for those of you who work actually in communication that can help to see, okay, am I doing this? Am I not doing this? But I won't go through all of these in detail. Sam, that should be 42 minutes. I'm sorry, slightly overrun. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone.